Good morning and welcome. I want to thank you for joining us with our monthly Foresight Talk session. This session is going to be on basic AIX security. The presentation is going to cover a lot of basics for Unix security in general, things like permissions and other related topics, and then from there we'll move on to some additional topics. For our agenda, I'm going to be covering basics, a bit of an introduction to why people hack and so on, permissions checklists, a number of tools that can help, and then I'll talk you through some of the publicly available tools, and then we'll talk a little bit about incident handling. The idea of this presentation is to help you protect your systems against hackers and other people that would infiltrate your systems. Towards the end, we'll talk about some of the new things that came in with AIX version 6 and version 7, and we'll talk a little bit about PowerSC. If there's time at the end, I can jump onto one of our servers in our BPIC and I can show you some of the commands and what the output looks like. I'm going to start with basically some of the security types, and this should be no news to anyone that's out there. So first thing is physical security. Obviously if somebody can't get to the machine through the machine room, then that's going to be helpful. I'll give you an example of physical security. I once talked to somebody who they had actually had one of their admins grab their server and throw it into the Hudson River, and then they threw the backup tapes in after it. They should never have been able to remove that server from the machine room. We have local security, and then we have things to do with how we actually secure the systems. Once we've got them taken care of physically, whether it's locked down, whether it's in a machine room that's secured, we still have to worry about things like the operating system. And I can tell you that I used to do a lot of investigating of machines that were broken into. 95% of the time they were back level and they had not been patched. Keeping your systems patched is really critical. As an example, AIX 6.1 TL8 Service Pack 3, AIX 7.1 TL2 Service Pack 3 both close some pretty serious security holes. If you are using some of the protocols that they're patching, you need to make sure you have those patches on. Obviously, microcode and firmware, keeping your BIOS and your HMC and keeping your HMC up to date, these are all important things, and there's security that you build into those. For instance, on the HMC, are you allowing everybody to log in using HSC root, or are you requiring that everybody have an individual account, and are you locking those accounts down? There are things you can do on the HMC. As an example, you can have view-only accounts. You can limit people to only looking at certain LPARs. So this is a way that you can give operations or DBAs access to the consoles of servers and LPARs that they need to have without giving them everything. Then we have security within the operating system. We have files and file systems, passwords, all of the things that you would expect. So let's talk a little bit about the kind of attacks that people make. Nirvana for most hackers is a root access break-in. If they can get root on the system, and there's plenty of ways that that can be done if you're running insecure protocols, then they own the keys to your door. Once that happens, they have a number of options. Sometimes they do nothing because they're just looking, and it's just a point of pride. Sometimes they'll replace materials. We've all heard of websites that have been hacked, where the front pages, etc., have been replaced with somewhat damning material. Sometimes they're going to do damage, and let's face it, if you go to your bank and you find that their website's been hacked, you're probably going to think about moving banks. Sometimes it's theft of proprietary information. I'm sure everybody's had the email where your credit cards got stolen from a web server somewhere. And then we have just the denial of service attacks, and these are pretty nasty simply because I don't need to break into your website. I simply need to attack it across the network such that nobody can get to it. And then, of course, we have worms and trojans and the things that people like to put into the machines. And there's different types. If you look at them, you know, we've got a lot of it's about embarrassment or stealing proprietary code. Some of it's harassment, email spam we all know and love. And, you know, then you get the kinds that are based on security breaches in the actual applications, such as buffer overflows. In 2004, SANS published their top 10 vulnerabilities. What's really interesting is that if you ever have an infiltration test, these are still pretty much the top 10 that people are testing for. There were a lot of bugs in DNS. and people still run back-level versions of DNS. General Unix authentication, accounts with no passwords or weak passwords. Add to that the people that get given such a complex password, the 20-character password from hell that has to have special characters and uppercase and lowercase and numbers. So what do? You write it down and you tape it underneath your keyboard. I see that all the time. Send mail was number 6, and in fact a lot of people think that if you need to be able to send email out from a server, you need to be running send mail. By default, send mail comes unconfigured and therefore is unsecure. So unless you're actually running as an SMTP server, which means a mail gateway, you should not start send mail automatically. And it starts in /etc/rc.tcp/IP. What you can do instead is you can run send mail by using a cron job and do what we call running the queues. So every hour you have send mail run through, check all the queues for mail to go out, just in case when they first attempted it, it didn't go out. By default, if you're on a server and you type in the mail command, that email will go out as long as it can connect to the remote server. If it can't connect, it sits in the queue, that's when you need to run the queues. So by default, send mail should not be running on your servers. Well, it's interesting that most of these problem children have not changed. I would have expected that over time, the services that were vulnerable would have changed, and that's definitely not the case. So it's kind of sad that we're still at 2004. They now publish their top 20 critical security controls. They've stopped publishing the top 10. And you can see here that there's a number of different things that are now issues for them. But I find it interesting that one of them is incident response and management. And there's a lot of issues around the fact that people in companies, when they have a problem, don't actually know what the protocols are and how you're supposed to deal with them. And we'll talk about that later on. So let's get into some Unix security basics. First, we're going to cover some permissions. And this is pretty basic stuff, but a lot of people don't have this all memorized. And there's some new ones. So the RW and X are pretty standard. If you do an ls-al, you'll see, it's got RWX, RWX, RWX. It may be some dashes. And those are read, write, and execute. In order to change into a directory, you have to have the execute bit. In order to execute an application, it has to have the execute bit. There's also, you sometimes see a lowercase s. That is, depending on whether it is on the owner or the group, that's either the SUID or SGID bit. And what that does is it runs the application as if it was either the owner or the group, no matter who you are running it. And then you may sometimes see a T, which is a sticky bit, and we'll talk about that more, or an E, which is something new that came out in AIX version 6, which means this is an encrypted file system. When you look at permissions, there's a 1 character, and then there's 3 groups of numbers. So the first ones are the owner, second is the group, and the third is everybody else. And permissions apply, as it says here, to devices, name sockets, files, directories, and first in, first outs. So permissions can be specified using RW and X or S&T. They can also be specified using octal. So for instance, if I want to specify SUID, I use the 4 to the very left here. For SGID or the sticky bit, you can see the numbers. And then we have the owner group. So I could say something like 4777, that would turn on SUID and give everybody RWX. I can also add things. So for instance, if I have somebody who doesn't have read access, I can do a +R, which will add read to everybody. I could do a G+R, which will just add read to the group, and so on. So there's a number of different ways you can specify them. If you're doing a find based on permissions, you will use the octal permissions. So you need to be fairly familiar with those. All right, so let's look a little bit about file security. So if we look at this, you could see that I have a dash at the beginning, which means this is just a regular file. It's not a directory. I have RWX for the owner, so Jackie has read, write, and execute. For the group, which is J group, I have R and X, so people can read the file, they could execute it, but they can't write to it. And then everybody else has the same permissions. The 1 here is the number of hard links to the file. Obviously my owner and my group are specified. The 4320 is the size in bytes, and then we have the dates. That's the file's modification time. We're going to talk a little bit about that because it's important for people to understand the difference between modification time and last access time and so on. So if you do an ls-l, it's going to show you the modification time for the file. That's the time it was last updated. If you do an ls-lu, it's going to show you the last time it was accessed. And the difference between those is the last time I opened the file but didn't change it. What's interesting is in AIX now, around AIX 6, I can't remember which TL, about 4 or 5 I think, they added the ability to put no A time on a file system, so that when you mount the file system you can mount it with no A time. Very common to see this with things like redo logs because nobody cares when you last accessed them, and you save yourself an I/O recording that information. Also, if anybody breaks into your system, one of the things they will do is replace commands like ls. And they can also do things like change your modification time and change your last access time. What they can't change is the last modification time of the inode. So if you're not certain that something is safe, you can always do the ls-lc and check the last modification time of the inode for the file. And that way, if it doesn't match the modification time for the file, there's a possibility you may have a problem. So here's some stuff I did the other night. And basically I did an ls-l on my messages log. You could see here that the last access time, last modification times was 7:11. The last access modification time, for the inode was also 7:11. But the last access was midnight the night before when this log was created. Then I did a tail on messages, and now you can see that my last access time is now 7:23. So just to give you an idea of how that would change. Now my modification times didn't change at all. The other thing that's important when you're looking at permissions is the UMask, and by default it's 022. What a UMask does is it looks at the permissions that are set by default and it subtracts the UMask from it so that when you create files and directories you get a different set of permissions. So as an example, by default, if you create a file, you would get 666. But if your UMask is 022, what you're really creating is 644. If you look down here, here's your 0022. By default, I would get read, write, execute, read and execute for group, and read and execute for other. Sorry, these are a little offset incorrectly. So this gives you an idea of the different UMasks and what the ending permissions would be. If you're not sharing things, for instance in your home directory, a lot of people will have a UMask of 077. And the reason for doing that is everything in the home directory then becomes protected completely from anybody else. So here are some examples. If I have a default UMask of 022, if I touch a file and create a directory, these are the permissions I get on them. So you can see that my file was created with read, write, read and read. My directory was created with read, write, execute, read, execute, read, execute. And actually I should have mentioned back here that this is for a directory, not a file. Okay, if I change that UMask to 007 and create the files, now you can see the difference in the permissions for file 2 and the directory. It's a good thing to understand this, and you can actually specify default UMasks. I think you can do it in /etc security. I'm not sure if it's in login.config. You can certainly specify it in Etsy profile or Etsy environment. Be very, very careful doing that, because if you change the default UMask for root, you will screw up all the permissions for everything you install. So it is much better to put it in the profile for the users so that you don't actually take that risk. Because there's nothing worse than doing a maintenance run and suddenly finding out that you just took away all access to all files, including operating system files from the users. So be very, very careful where you specify this default UMask. Alright, and now to the SUID, SGID and sticky bits. So if you add the permission of 4000 to a program, like I said before, that program, no matter who executes it, will run as if it was the program's owner. If you look around the operating system, you'll find a lot of stuff that's owned by root or other things that have this SGID bit set. The SGID is for the program's group. So one of the things you do when you're looking for hackers is you actually scan, and you can see down here we scan for permissions 4,000 or 2,000, and we look for things that are set to SUID or SGID that are not operating system files. So, for instance, you may scan /home and look for those because people shouldn't be really setting up SUID and SGID programs in there. And if you were to find things owned by root in a user's directory with the SGID bit or SUID bit set, that should make you very suspicious. The sticky bit is actually extremely useful. In fact, you will always see it on /temp. I tend to put it on work directories. I work a lot with SAS, so it'll be on SAS work. And basically what the purpose of it is that whatever file is created, only root or the owner can delete or rename that file. So for instance, if you have an accounting group that wants to share files, you can create a directory with the sticky bit. Then whoever creates the file can create it, and they can modify it and so on, but nobody else can delete or rename it. There was a usage for it previously that caused stuff to be left in the swap space after termination. That is no longer what the sticky bit does, but I put this in here just in case you find documentation that refers to it. The way it is used in AIX is exactly what I have here about basically protecting files within temporary directories. So here's some examples of setting a sticky bit. If you look at /temp, you'll see here this lowercase t. If it's a lowercase t, that means it's got the execute on as well as the sticky bit. If it was an uppercase T, it would just be the sticky bit without execute. So here in user local, I created the directory. By default, my directory was set to 755. I changed it to be 777 so everybody could write to it because it was a temporary directory. I set its ownership, and then I added the sticky bit. As soon as I added the sticky bit, from then on, any file or whatever that was created under here would be protected with the sticky bit. You don't have to do it in such a complicated way. I could simply have done a chmod 1777, but I just wanted to show you the different steps for setting permissions so you could see the changes here. Now, sometimes you need more than just permissions to protect things, and this is where things get very, very complicated. You could actually use ACLs or access control lists. I've just got one slide in here on them, but I just wanted to show you what you can do with it, and then it's something that you really have to test. So the purpose of ACLs is to take whatever the base permissions are and to add what we call extended permissions. So by default, my directory here, which is my user local Jackie Durr, has no ACL specified. So because I didn't enable ACLs on it, they extend the permissions so as disabled. However, once you enable ACLs, and there's this link down the bottom here will show you exactly how to do all that. Once you enable them, it will show as extended permissions enabled. And now you can do permits, denies, and specifies. So here I can say that I'm going to allow the user DHS read-write access, but I'm going to deny Chaz read, and anybody in the system group can't read it either. And then I can also specify read access to a bunch of different groups and users, and so on. So you can get very complicated, but what's really nice is you can say everybody in the account group has this level of access, and then if you change somebody out of the account group because their job's changed or whatever else, their permissions automatically change. So it just lets you get more granular. If you want to find out what the ACLs are on a directory, you use the ACL get. If you want to change them, you use ACL edit. And then you have a number of other ACL commands you can use. Be very careful with ACLs. Don't use them on system directories or anything like that. But go ahead and start experimenting with them on directories that you have customer data, etc. in. All right, so let's start to talk about actually securing your system. So what a lot of people do by default is they just go into files and they comment things out. And the classic is inetd.conf. If you look at most people's inetd.conf, it's about like 85, 86 lines long, and there's a whole bunch of stuff commented out, plus a bunch of comments, and you never ever know after a maintenance run if something got added back in. Plus, some of the services that are automatically enabled in there are very, very insecure. The classics are TTDB server and CMSD, the calendar server, which nobody uses, but for some reason they're uncommented by default. What I normally do is I will take a copy of a file. My standard is I basically would copy inetd.conf to inetd.conf dash my initials and the date. That way someone knows that I did it and when I did it. I will then go into the original and I will edit it, and I don't just comment things out, I delete everything that I'm not using. So my typical inetd.conf file is about 3 or 4 lines long. I may have a couple of services in there that I've got there for reasons, so I'll have them commented out, but I can tell when I open my inetd.conf, because it's 4 or 5 lines long, it fits on one screen, I know immediately that I have actually, something's got added back in. One of the things when you do maintenance that I've noticed is sometimes it will uncomment something if it's an inetd.conf after a maintenance run. It typically does not add it back in if it's not in there. I look in a knit tab. There are things in a knit tab that you don't need to be running. As an example, towards the top, there are a couple of lines that have ATM in them. If you're not running an ATM network, you don't need those. But it's good to go through a knit tab and make sure you understand what is in there and why. Also, /etc/rc.tcp/IP. In there, so it automatically starts send mail. You may find an ATM line. And there's a whole bunch of things about SNMP. There's SNMPD, SNMP MIBD, and a bunch of others. I think I have a slide later on them. But you do not want to have those running unless you are actually using SNMP to monitor the MIBs. And if you are, then you need to customize SNMP and not let it run in public. Otherwise, as soon as your security department does a security scan, you're going to fail the security scan. So look into those. If you're not using SNMP-based monitors, then disable them. However, if you install a director agent or platform agent, even though you comment all this out in rc.tcp/IP, it is going to go and start SNMP anyway. I also check what I have in /etc/rc.local. I do not normally add customizations where I add things to a knit tab. Instead, I add a tab down the bottom, which is a 2:1, and I have it execute /etc/rc.local. Then I put my things that I want to add in there. I'm not going to go through these checklists in great detail. I have 3 pages of checklists of things that I go through and I double check when I'm doing security scans. So as an example, everything's individual accounts. Now this is pretty standard on most of your systems anyway, but I also make sure they have good passwords. And a good password to me is not a 25-character password that's made up of hieroglyphics. It has to be something that somebody can remember, but still be a reasonable password. I see so many mistakes over passwords where people think that these very complicated passwords are good passwords, and as I said before, it just makes people write them down. I always disable TFTP. If I can't disable it, I actually have a /etc/tftpaccess.control file. I'll show you an example of that later. I scan for .rhost files and core files and delete them every night. I don't like those to stick around, and .rhost files are very insecure because they basically allow somebody to remotely connect to your server without a password. Checking logs, the SU log, the security log, etc., you need to make sure you're doing that. Only allowing root to log in at the console, that's a recommendation that most people make. However, for the most part, people do allow root to log in remotely because of the fact that most of us are doing support remotely as well now. The use of SU or sudo should be carefully logged. I like sudo because it actually provides logs of the actual commands as well. Setting your UMask, again, as I mentioned, you do want to set your UMask, but you want to make sure that you only do it for regular users, not any of the system users. Getting rid of the guest account, getting rid of just dormant or inactive accounts. I actually add /bin/false as a login shell to /etc/security/login.cfg. By doing that, I can set any user ID to have a shell of /bin/false, so someone can try to log in as them and they get nothing. This making regular backups and checking restores, I can't tell you how many times that somebody's had to go to a backup and they've never tested it and it's not working. That's not so much of a protection against hackers, but it's definitely important if you have to recover afterwards. And the last thing, when you log in, checking that last login. If you know you didn't log in for 2 weeks, you log in and you see that your last login was yesterday, you probably should be asking some questions. So on the second page, a number of other comments. The host.equiv and host.lpd, I actually completely empty those. Because all that's in them is comments normally, unless you're using something like Yellow Pages or NetGroups. And most security scanners, particularly if you're running an internal security scanner on the server, will pick up if there's anything in there. I've already made the comments about sendmail, and FTP is pretty common, making sure you secure that. I'm going to talk a little bit about hidden directories later when I talk about rootkits. But if you were to do an ls-al and see dot, and dot, then you have a hidden directory, and the second one is probably dot space or dot space space. Very, very common for hackers to actually create those kind of directories. They'll also sometimes create one called .k, but they try to make a directory that looks normal to people so that you won't go looking into it. Checking through the etc password file and so on is pretty common. Sensible passwords. And checking that .forward files are not executable. I actually scan the system looking for .forward files, because if someone sets up a .forward file as executable, it's very easy for somebody to break in and put a command in there and execute it. And then lastly, setting up logging, backing up logs, disabling things, documenting your install and all changes. I personally hate documentation almost as much as I hate change control, but having said that, without documentation, you don't know how to compare what you have to what's been changed. So by documenting it thoroughly, you have the ability to rebuild it. I also every night create what I call a recovery list, where I basically go through the system and pretty much grab a list of files that tells me how it was set up, what's in what disks are in which volume groups, etc., so that if I had to rebuild things I could. Makes it much easier. Other than that, obviously keeping the system patched. I also set up NTP or a similar time protocol to keep the time. My whole life at one of my previous employers used to be doing security investigations, and one of the things I found was quite often there's multiple systems involved and you are correlating logs. And if one log is an hour and 15 minutes off from the other logs, trying to build a coherent history of what happened is a nightmare. By using NTP, you have all of the servers and LPARs running with the same time, so that when you're looking at logs and comparing things, you can get things to match up properly. So that's our checklist. So now we're going to talk about some other bits and pieces you can do. One of the things you want to do is have login banners. And there was some case law many years ago where somebody argued that because the server said welcome to AIX at the login prompt, that meant they were being invited in, and therefore it wasn't an illegal login. So I have a nice friendly banner. When you get my login prompt, it says unauthorized use of this system is prohibited, login : And you do that by going to etsy-security-login.config, and you have a herald. And you add this line in under the default, and everybody that goes to your console will get that. So if I SSH in, this is what I will see. I will not see welcome to AIX. The other thing that I do is update the message of the day. So my message of the day is equally as unfriendly. You probably have one already, based on whatever your legal department's put. But pretty much I have stuff that says use is authorized, etc., etc. Sometimes I add a line that says everything on the system that is going to be logged, if you have a problem with it, go away. But you're getting the general idea here that having a login banner when people log in, and also having the actual login at the console showing up as saying that unauthorized access is prohibited, just adds a little bit of extra warning for people. Makes it much easier if you actually do have to take action. And there is a way to force people, even when they use X Windows or FTP or anything else, to see your message of the day. And we'll talk about that when we talk about TCP wrappers. Okay, so there's a number of third-party and IBM tools out there that you're going to need to install in order to be able to run some of the security protocols. So what I've done here is I checked these links 2 days ago. So the IBM expansion pack, over towards the right of the screen, you'll see a thing where you click on Downloads. It includes the LSOF command, which is for listing open files, but that also includes network connections. If you want to run NTP version 4, you get it there. And it has OpenSSH and OpenSSL, as well as Perl and Samba updates. I use the Perl that comes with the regular CD, but I get my Samba, OpenSSL, and OpenSSH from here. Even though it's back level to what the highest levels are, one of the things I found is that since AIX6, when IBM moved over to the new click libraries, compiling anything that has encryption in it is a nightmare. And I got tired of fighting the compile battles, so I run these versions of OpenSSH and OpenSSL that come with the expansion pack because it is much, much easier to use them. Additionally, the same with Samba. Samba's a little back level, but the Samba that they provide has Active Directory connections and LDAP connections built into it. And getting that to compile is just no fun at all. Additionally, there's the Linux toolbox, and in the Linux toolbox you can get sudo as well as GCC and a number of other prereqs, because some of the third-party software will be RPM type installs from the old Linux style, and in order to do that you're going to need some prereqs. So that's all there on the Linux AIX toolbox. When you get AIX, they will probably ship you the DVDs with these on them. I normally still download them from the web because it's more up to date. One of the tools that I do download is TCP wrappers. I get that from porcupine.org, and what TCP wrappers allows you to do is wrap a network service such that you can actually write little rules around it, that only certain IP addresses can access it, or you can force log entries so you can say that somebody tried to access this, I didn't allow them to, but I've got their IP address now. And then I have a number of others listed here. Snort is a network IDR type system, so it actually monitors network accesses, etc. Do not run Snort without getting permission, because it does do some network scanning type actions. S-Tunnel allows you to do secure tunnels using SSL, so it allows you to tunnel between systems. And then for logging, we obviously have Swatch and Log Surfer that actually will monitor your logs and send you messages. These you will need to compile. And then lastly is the Nessus Vulnerability Scanner. That is a network scanner, so again, just like with Snort, you should check with your security department before running it. There's a very good chance they have it anyway. Alright, so I want to talk more about TCP wrappers and Secure Shell. I always tell people that if you're not running TCP wrappers, then you really don't have network logging on your system. Now, there are third-party tools out there, commercial ones that you can buy, that obviously give you some of this. But the idea of the wrapper is that it allows you to add additional security and logging. Combined with SSH, you can now do secure backups, tunneling, and some X11 forwarding. You can use reverse DNS lookups, so you can say, if you're not familiar with a reverse DNS lookup, when I look up somebody, I'm looking up the name and getting back the IP, and then I look up the IP to get back the name. And those two have to match. The problem with reverse DNS lookups is half the ISPs out there don't know how to configure their own systems, so those will sometimes fail. And if it fails, it won't allow access. That in TCP wrappers is called paranoid mode. So if you do have an issue with people who are failing reverse DNS lookups, then you're going to have to turn paranoid mode off. Since you're always compiling TCP wrappers, you will have that option. For SSH, we have SSH itself encrypting logins, SCP for secure copies, and then you can actually customize secure FTP to replace FTP with an SSH. Just watch out with SFTP because it only transfers files in binary mode. So if you have ASCII files like .txt files, it is going to screw them up. I tend to prefer SCP, or what I do is I tar up whatever I want to do and then I FTP it, and that way I don't care if it's binary. OpenSSH does require OpenSSL, and typically if you're installing everything where you're compiling it, you install SSL, then the wrapper, then SSH. But if you're using the IBM binaries, then you just install the wrapper last. And then you want to make sure in your SSHD_config that you do not enable support for version 1 of SSH. You should only allow for version 2. That is because version 1 has major security holes in it. As I said with OpenSSL, I use the one from the IBM expansion pack, which is at 0.9.8e, I think. And that is what OpenSSH expects right now. if you're using the OpenSSH from IBM. However, if you want to run the latest, then I've got the links here for it, but I will make, and how to configure it, but I will make the comment that if you do that, it's going to conflict with the OpenSSH that IBM uses off the expansion pack. So I would use the ones that come with that. So OpenSSH, as I said, it's going to interface with TCP wrappers and we'll get all the logging and access control. If you want to get a free SSH client, you can go download PuTTY. I think 90% of the sites I go into, people are using PuTTY. There are also very, very good commercial SSH clients out there, as well as SFTP and STP clients, many of which are GUI based. So let's talk about some of the things you can do with SSH. And I think I have an article down the bottom here. There's an article at IBM Systems Magazine that actually talks about some of these things and how to do them. So this is just a summary of that. So I can do X11 forwarding, which means I can actually encrypt Network X Windows traffic, which by default is not encrypted. That way people can't modify the streams in flight and they can't see what you're actually doing. I can also forward ports. So I could actually tell it that whenever somebody does a telnet, I'm going to change that port such that I'm going to force them to use SSH behind the scenes. A lot of people will also do port forwarding for POP or SNMP, and that way you can tunnel those through a secure channel, and you can also force them to tunnel through firewalls and so on. One of the uses I see a lot for SSH is people doing backups via a tunnel. So they'll set up a tunnel between the backup server and the client, and there's ways to do that where you don't have to put the passwords in, and then you can run the backup remotely. You can also run PPP over a tunnel, and there's a number of other tools that use it. It's very useful. Here's an example down here where I'm running a tar on the directory, and then I'm SSHing to Nimit, and I'm actually saving my tar file there. Pretty basic, but there's a number of other things that you can do. Alright, so when you look at SSH, there's the SSH command, which makes you a client. You'll also see SSHD, which is the daemon running. If you want to configure your client, you go to it should be in /etc/ssh, and then there's an ssh_config file. Now, sometimes it's in a different location, simply because you did a third-party install, compiled it, so it may end up in user local etc. It may end up in /user local ssh. Typically, this is where I would start. If you want to configure the daemon, and quite often you do, you look for the hd_config. Some of the other commands, I have the ability to load keys into memory so that people don't have to use passwords in certain circumstances. And the agent that we use for loading those is SSH agent. In order to get the keys into SSH agent, we use SSH add. And of course, to generate the keys, we use the keygen. We have a number of programs here, as well as the SCP and SFTP, that you should be aware of. And again, I think those are described in that article that I referred to before. Okay, I mentioned that you can do tunneling. So here's an example of how you might want to tunnel Telnet and FTP so that you get a secure connection. So what I'm doing here is I'm SSHing and telling it to set up port 1234, it has to be greater than 1024, on my client and connect it to port 23. So that allows me to start an encrypted session. Then from the client, I just telnet to my local host at 1234, and now I actually have a secure tunnel back to the server. This is something that's well worth trying. It allows you to basically use your telnet client if you don't have one, but end up with SSH behind the scenes, and the same with FTP. And the difference is you just tell it what port to go to. So more on TCP wrappers. This is the very latest version of TCP wrappers. It's actually several years old, but the key thing is that it is the one that includes IP version 6. Even if you are not running IP version 6, you need to use this version. Otherwise, when you look in the logs, all the IP addresses will say 0.0.0.0. There's a couple of different ways that you can run TCP wrappers. You have the ability to replace the current service. So you can tell it, replace telnet with the wrapper. Or you can do it such that you install it into user local bin, and then in inetd.conf you insert it into the line. I prefer option 2. The reason that I prefer option 2 is because when I run maintenance, maintenance will replace things like telnet, etc., and then I have to remember to go back and redo or my replacements. Whereas if I use option 2 where I insert it into inetd.conf, I only have to check one place and make sure my wrapper is still inserted. TCP wrappers, as I mentioned before, basically logs attempts to access and then looks to see if you're allowed to do it. And it will also allow you to add banners whether the service is granted or not, so that's very useful. With option 2, what happens is inetd calls the wrapper, checks the rules files, which are the host.allow and host.deny, applies the rules, and then determines what's going to happen regarding access. TCP wrappers is one that you have to compile, so you download it, you untar it, you look at the make file, and these are the different options that you have to set. I always use log daemon. By default they use log mail and log info. So that means when I'm logging, I'm going to daemon.info, and I set up a separate file for that. You do need to uncomment this line about IP version 6, whether you have IP version 6 or not. This paranoid mode by default is enabled. If you don't want them to do reverse DNS lookups, then you want to comment that out. You run a make clean, a make AIX, and then you copy the actual daemon. There's no make install, which is quite annoying. You copy the daemon into your local bin, you copy the header if you're compiling SSH into the SSH source directory. If you're not compiling SSH, then don't worry about it. And then you copy this wrapper into user local lib. And then we go edit inetd.conf and we create host.allow, host.deny. Once you've saved inetd.conf, you're going to refresh inetd. Do not log off. Make sure first of all that you are able to still log on from another connection, because otherwise you may put yourself in a situation where you can't log back in. It's very easy to get these rules wrong. So here's an example of what I do in inetd.conf. Right, so here's my FTP line. And basically what I've done is I've inserted this user local bin TCPD in front of the FTP command. So normally this would have said FTP blah blah root, user bin FTPD, and all the rest of this. Instead, I've inserted the wrapper. So when somebody comes in the FTP port, the wrapper will kick off, it will go through its security stuff, and then it will execute the rest of this. And interestingly enough, you can see on my FTP, I've got a UMask set here. The same with Telnet, and then I have rexecd, and I just have some in here to show you as an example. If you want to wrap a service because you want to know that people are trying, but you don't want them to be able to log in, one way to do that is to add that bin false as a valid shell into etc security.login.config. It's all the way down the bottom. And then here's an example with rlogin, where I replace the rlogin line by inserting my TCP wrapper. That way I'll get a log entry. And then I set it to bin false, so that if somebody tries login, I get a log entry, but they don't ever get anything other than log back out. And as I mentioned, I clean out my inetd.conf. One comment about NIM. If you're running a NIM server, it does not like bootp or tftpd to be wrapped. So what I normally do with my NIM server is I keep those commented out, and then when I want to do something with NIM, I uncomment bootpd or and tftpd, refresh inetd, do whatever I want to do with NIM, and then I comment them back out and refresh it. That way bootp and tftp aren't available most of the time. I'm big on passing security scans. Okay, so I said there were two configuration files, host.deny and host.allow. So there's two ways you can do the host.deny. I use option 1. I go all : all. What that says is I will deny everybody who is trying to access any service that is TCP wrapped unless I specify otherwise in host.allow. It's much, much simpler. Or you can get incredibly complicated like here, and you can have individual rules. You know, deny everybody, spawn a message that says TCP wrappers refused by, and a whole bunch of stuff, and mail it to some user ID that you don't like. To me, that's just way too complicated. So I just do an all : all and keep it very, very simple. Then I put all the meat into my host.allow. So there's 3 columns that you can code in your host.allow. The first one is the service, the second one is the rules, and the third one is extra stuff you want to do under options. So under options, I can have it do an ident lookup, I can add a banner, I can spawn a command, although spawn is only used for deny connections. So I never do RFC 931 because what that does is it goes back to the server that the person is coming from, and it does an ident lookup. Very common if it's a hacker for them to actually have something else running on that port that you might not want to communicate with. The same, a lot of people used to run this thing called safe finger that would actually do a finger back to that other server. Again, you don't know what they're really running. So I don't do any of that. I do, however, quite often put a banner so that the person is forced to see a message of the day or whatever. Normally I just point it to /etc/motd because that's very simple and then everything is consistent. So here's an example of what you don't want to do. Alright, my host.deny says all : and then I have all my services listed and I go, everybody can access them, but at least I'll get it. This is a better one. For SSH, I'm letting everybody access it. SendMail or so Telnet, what I'm saying is local. If you don't put local, you can't do a Telnet 0, so you can't Telnet to localhost. So I always include local. Then I'm saying anyone in the 192.168.1, whoever Telnet's in is going to see this message of the day whether they want to or not. And I've done that for all of, different versions for all the protocols. You can do it by 192.168.1.star, which is what this is. You can do for the domain name like abc.com. You notice there's a dot in front of it. I can do it for a specific IP address. You have a number of choices that you can do. But it basically lets you build a very simple little firewall that's very, very basic. I had mentioned Snort before, and it is an intrusion detection tool. You can also use it as a packet sniffer and as a packet logger. A couple of warnings about Snort. Number one, it quite often puts the interface into promiscuous mode, which will raise a flag with your security people. Secondly, if you don't customize it properly, it will generate tons and tons of data. But it is a very useful tool for finding intrusions. So I would talk to your security department and ask them if they're running anything like that, if they want you to test something like that with them, but I would not just go ahead and just run it. But feel free to go to the website and do some reading up on it. I've found it to be very useful in the past. It's basically a network sniffer. I mentioned S-Tunnel. This is used for encrypting TCP sessions via SSL. And where it's really useful is if you're running IMAP or POP or LDAP clients and daemons, you can actually wrap those. So now all of a sudden I can have TCP wrappers controlling IMAP and POP connections. So I can literally say, if somebody wants to use POP to get to my SendMail server, they have to be in this domain or whatever. It gives you just an extra level of security. So let's talk about logging. Because by default, syslogd runs, and by default, syslogd doesn't really log anything. You need to go into etc syslog.conf and actually configure it. And what you'll find, for instance, on your VIO servers is it logs a couple of things, but it doesn't log typically accesses, etc. What you will see in the syslog.conf is you will see facility.priority space action. So, for instance, auth would be the facility, notice would be the priority, and action would be write it to user local log syslog. There's a number of different levels here, and depending on what you have, for instance, if I have a priority of debug, then everything above it will go in. So this is just explaining to you what the different levels of facility actually record. So mail is going to be mail, news, local use. Quite often you'll see local 2 if you're running something like a radius server. So under priority, we have a hierarchy from debug all the way down, and pretty much if you have debug, you get all of these. If you have info, you get all of these. If you have emergency only, then you're not going to get notices, etc. I tend to use info unless I have something. I do mail.debug on a mail server. I want everything. So then you've got actions that you can take. So what are the actions? Well, one option is /dev/console, where it logs it to the console. But with the servers that we're running today with multiple LPARs, pretty much nobody has a console connected anymore that an operator sits in front of and watches. So I don't use that. I tend to use the option 2, which is /path/file, where I actually write the messages to a file. I will tell you that if you're using that, before you start the syslog-d, you need to touch the file. For some reason it doesn't create it. You also have the ability to log to a central host, so you would code @ and then the host name, and then there's some configuration you have to do at the other host. Or if you really don't like somebody, you can just have them send an email. And then the last option is to send messages to all logged in users, which I really don't recommend. So typically I use either path file or @log host or some combination thereof. And again, you can use Swatch or Log Surfer or a number of other things. You can write your own scripts to post-process the logs. What I tend to do is take my logs, I cycle them off to a log server at night, and then I have scripts that will run on that log server that scan the logs looking for certain behaviors. That way I don't have to run those scripts on every server. And I have a copy of the logs in case somebody gets on the server and tries to delete them. So here's an example of a logging thing. Here I touch the actual logs, and I have 4 of them. Emergency alert, errors and crits are all going to syslog. Mail.debug goes to its own log. Auth.notice goes to auth log. So that's my logins. Daemon.info, if you remember, is where I put all the TCP wrapper stuff. I put it to its own log. I happen to have here emergency going to dev console. Normally I wouldn't do that, but I just wanted to show you. It says you can refresh syslog-d. What I have found is it's better for me to stop it and start it rather than refresh it. It just seems to be cleaner. And as I said, I use separate logs for easier post-processing because obviously I'm going to write a script that scans my auth log and my info log looking for security attempts. I never allow logs to log to /var. If /var fills up, your server's going to go down. And it's very embarrassing going to management saying, well, you know you made me add a list security logging? Well, I did that. And I logged so much data and I wasn't paying attention and /var filled up and we took an outage. So I normally create a user local logs file system and I log into that. That way if user local logs fills up, all that happens, which is not good, is we stop logging, but I'd rather stop logging than take the system down. Let's talk a little bit about hackers and the kind of things that they do. So the tools that they have is everything you have. Plus they have a number of other tools, and of course they can go out on the internet and literally get line-by-line guides on how to do this. They'll have programs like Xscan that scan a subnet for OpenX servers and will log the keystrokes. They have the ability using WZAP or similar programs to remove users' information from WTemp. So as an example, if you have accounting turned on, which is going to log everything for WTemp, they have the ability to remove anything about themselves from there. I already mentioned the directories like ..space and ..and .k and so on. They use Nmap, ident scanning. I mean, there's a number of different tools they have. And a lot of people think that because you're behind a firewall, you're protected from this kind of behavior. When I worked at a college, 30,000 of my hackers were inside the firewall, so I pretty much ignored firewalls. But additionally, the purpose of a firewall is to allow certain protocols in. And one of the things that hackers have access to is software that allows them, once they find an open port, to tunnel all other protocols through that port. So really a firewall provides a certain amount of protection, but from somebody that really wants to get in, it's not going to provide you with any. So this is why we have to pay attention to securing the systems by going through those checklists that I gave you earlier. As I said earlier, a hacker is getting root access on your system. Once they do that, they will install a rootkit. Part of what a rootkit does is it modifies your commands. So they'll modify the ps command, the ls command, they'll update ifconfig and netstat, and this is what they're typically hiding in their .space or .space directories. And I bring this up because one of the things that you really need to do after you build a system is create a CD that has safe versions of the commands. So copy ps, copy ls, ifconfig and netstat, commands that you think you would use if you were trying to figure out what was going on. Then what you would do if you think that a system's been compromised, use the ps command off of the CD. Because I will tell you that having seen some rootkit results, they modify ps so that their little programs don't ever show up. ls stops showing directories like .space, etc. So if you think you've been compromised, you cannot trust the programs that are on your server. You need to have a safe copy. There's a number of different ways you can detect rootkits. assuming that you have your safe copies of the software. From the place where they like to hide things is they'll hide them as /dev/ptyw or pty something, and they'll put stuff in those. You could try running the commands on the LPAR with a -- option. That is a guarantee that a rootkit's been installed if you actually get something back. You can use PS to compare things. I actually tried this the other day and it didn't work as well as it used to. And like I said, use your safe copies of things like top LSOF. You might want to put nmon in there, TCP list, etc. And then you can also check these 3 files and see if there are binary zeros at the end. If that's the case, then somebody used WZAP on them. I've been fortunate enough to, in previous lives, get access to systems that have had rootkits on them, and it's really fascinating how innovative some of these people are. And it's kind of sad too. One of the things that your network people are going to want to do is find out if people are running sniffers. And somebody could be on your server running one. So you can run ifconfig and look for promiscuous mode. You can use things like nmap. You can look at netstat, or you can use the LSOF and do a grep on UDP or TCP. What's nice about using LSOF is it will actually show you all the active connections and all of the open ports, so you can actually see what you're running versus what you think you're running. Of all of these, the one that you don't want to run without talking to your network people and security people is the nmap command. And if you do find a sniffer, then obviously you need to take some kind of action. On that note, I'll talk about scanning yourself, and you note the bit I've got in red. I used to do intrusion detection testing for companies. Letter on letterhead from their vice president before I would do any scanning, because I wanted to make sure I had permission. There's a number of very good scanners out there. Saint, which came out of Satan, which was a very, very good tool. ISS, Nessus, all of those are very good scanners that provide a lot of information on open ports, etc. And I've seen some output recently from both Nessus and ISS. They're kept very up to date, and they actually provide a lot of detail on, for instance, AIX APARs, etc. that you need to install. So if your security people have that software, I would ask them to scan your LPARs, because it's better that you find it before you have friends on the system. So I quite often, after I set up a server, will ask the security department to do the scans before we release it. In some companies, that's a requirement. You could also go to SourceForge and get this thing called Port Sentry, and what that will actually do is it runs on the LPAR and it monitors the ports on the LPARs. You need to look at these and figure out which ones fit in with your strategy. I mentioned LSOF, and I'll show you an example of it later, but what's really nice about it is that it allows you to find out what ports are on, what ports are active and who's listening on them. It also is useful if you have files you're trying to figure out who has this particular file, because what LSOF stands for is List Open Files. It regards network ports as a file. I have the link here for downloading it to compile it, but actually it comes on either the Linux toolkit or the AIX expansion pack. I know I listed it way back in that slide. You can also do a netstat and pipe it to more, and that will actually show you the active connections. Obviously using showmount and showmount-e to see NFS stuff, and RPC info and RPC info-p will also show you information, and we can run those later on if we do the demo at the end. One of the things I want to talk about for a few slides is, well, so what happens when you do get broken into, or incident reporting? A lot of people don't know how to gather evidence correctly, and because of that, when you do gather it, you can't use it. So you need to understand that, and you need to have a strategy for how you gather it. You need to know any legal issues. You need to know who to contact and how. I always used to have an abusat email alias on every server, so that there was always an abusat. The problem is, of course, some people think you should send abuse to it, but it's actually, most people will try to send email if they think that somebody from your site is trying to break into theirs. They will send it to an abusat email address to see if there is one. You need to know what your company's strategy is for reporting things. As an example, at what point do you involve the FBI or the police? Oh, and by the way, they may be coming to you. In the past, I've worked with both the FBI, police, and actually Interpol on break-ins, and it's not a lot of fun when they come to you. Do you have a local computer crime bureau? It's good to know those things. Again, most of this is stuff your security department takes care of, and you're just going to report this to your security department. But you really do need to know the policies that if you notice a hacker's on the server, is the policy to immediately shut it down, which I don't recommend. Is the policy take it off the network? What is the policy that they have? And this leads into there should be an emergency response team. Clear set of policies and procedures. And that's going to have things like who to contact and how, what are the security policies, what are your evidentiary gathering rules. And one of the things that we all hate is the clearly written acceptable use policy. Hopefully you have one of those that you all sign yearly or every 6 months or whatever that details how you as a user will behave. Let's talk about gathering evidence. In the past, some of the stuff I had to do was gather evidence to go to court, and that's very, very different because chain of custody is critical. I remember being asked to look at a machine that had been broken into, and they had literally, when they found that had been broken into, they turned it off, threw it in a closet, and then 3 days later called for help. The problem was it was an unlocked closet. Anybody had access to it, so there was no real chain of custody. If you are dealing with that kind of thing, you need to have a clear chain of custody, who did what. It all needs to be written down and logged so that, if necessary, you can use that as evidence. You'll also hear terms like a preservation letter. If you're being broken into from an ISP, you actually need to send them preservation letters to ask them to save the logs from this particular IP address so that you can then subpoena them. Otherwise, those logs will be gone within 24 hours. So this is not stuff you sit on. You need copies of all your own logs, signed and dated, preferably. I always print them out and also copy them to CD, and I make somebody witness them. In my worst case, I had 500 pages of logs that I printed that somebody sat down and signed and dated with me. That was overkill, but it was very useful later. Making sure that when you do copy to a CD, that you copy it with permissions and dates preserved, because otherwise it's going to become unusable. And you have to figure out what it is you want to copy. Output from the last com commands, the ls, the lsof, remembering to do it from your safe CD version. And if you're dealing with email, and this is a very common thing, a lot of what you get is email harassment, and most people do not know that the headers in emails can be completely hacked. So you actually need the raw headers, and there are methodologies for tracing those. And if we look at the next slide, these are some links for finding out how to get email raw headers. They are very, very different to regular headers. So they're not going to just say from Jackie at server4.com. They're going to have a whole bunch of information tracing every server that it went through, some of which will be fake, but there are ways to find that out once you understand how to do email and website tracing. So I have some links here that you should find useful. In particular, the haltabuse.org one is very helpful because it's very difficult if you're using Outlook to actually get the headers. So you should be able to find information at these. Okay, I have a little bit here on laws, only because there are some that are actually very useful to know about. My personal favorite is 18 U.S.C. 2511 because that's the one that protects me as a systems administrator as long as I'm doing my duly designated job. 1030 is the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, and this is the one that covers access to protected systems against hackers, but this is also why it's useful to have that change to the message of the day and to your login prompt. There was also the Net Act of 1997, and it changed the copyright laws. There used to be this thing called the Lamachia loophole, which was, Lamachia was a guy from MIT, and he broke into a whole bunch of systems, but because he didn't do anything where he got a financial gain, they couldn't do anything about it. In 1997, that changed with the No Electronic Theft Act, and now if you break into a system and you don't get financial gain, it's still illegal. I got a bunch of different laws here. If you are having trouble sleeping, feel free to go and read them. But I just wanted to mention these because a lot of people think that a lot of things are not protected. In fact, they are. And there's more laws than this now. There's a whole bunch more that I have listed here, including, for instance, for harassment, 18 U.S.C. 2261. If I harass you across the internet and I go across state lines, that's illegal. There's a whole bunch of them now, and some of them, of course, are by state. So also, I put a couple of links down here, and in particular the Federal Search and Seizure Guidelines. If you're gathering electronic evidence, this is a good one to read because it actually has the rules for doing so. And then I just have a bunch of other useful ones here. And of course you have things like HIPAA and SOX and so on. Let's go to AIX and security advisories. So IBM actually has, under their subscriptions, one of the things that you can subscribe to is security advisories. And you can do it by operating system. So for instance, I always subscribe to AIX 6.1 and AIX 7.1 security advisories. And as soon as they come out, I look at them, I figure out if it's a protocol that I'm running, and I apply it, as needs be. You could also go to CERT. Now CERT got moved. It used to be cert.org. They have all the alerts, and they also have all the Windows and Linux and everything else stuff at this new government site. And then there's the National Vulnerability Database. Those are the three that you want to be subscribed to, because you'll get, assuming that you work with security all the time. That will provide you with the information so that you can be proactive, not wait till your security department comes to you and says, go patch this. You can actually have these come to you and go, you know what, I think I'm going to go patch this because this is a really bad security problem on a protocol that I use. We're going to talk a little bit now about some specifics with AIX 6 and 7. Prior to AIX version 6, we had auditing and authorization. We had some encryption using crypto cards. And in fact, in 5.3, they brought in the crypto library in C, the click support, so that all of your encryption was done differently. And in fact, the click libraries were actually on the expansion pack, which was not available overseas. So they added a lot of things in 5.3. You could do LDAP integration. You could have 255 character passwords as long as you knew how to specify it. They also brought in PAM, which integrates with a lot of applications like SAS, etc. for access. And they brought in the file permission manager and ACLs. But these were all at a very basic level. This is also in the trusted computing base, and a lot of things like OpenSSH, etc. and AIX Security Expert came in. AIX Security Expert came in at 5.3 TL5. You had the option of low, medium, or high. And I could tell you, I don't know anyone that used high, because the first thing high did was disable the network. And personally, I don't find an LPAR very useful if I can't get to it from the network. They also added this file protection manager, and we're going to talk a little more about those. So then they brought out AIX 6.1, and a lot of what came in AIX 6.1 was actually some significant security enhancements. There is a security red book that I've got a link to, but for auditing, they finally added COVID and SOX compliance reporting. So you can run an audit report and find out if you're COVID or SOX compliant. I think since then they may also have added some HIPAA stuff. They did a lot of enhancements to AIX Security Expert, adding things to do with password policies, the SOX, some IPsec things, and they also added the option of SOX in AIX Security Expert, so you can tell AIX Security Expert to secure for SOX. What I tend to do is look at what AIX Security Expert does, and I tend to go and do it manually, only because there are some things that it locks down that just don't make sense to me. They also changed RBAC to become enhanced RBAC. So this is the role-based access control. And this is actually, WPARs use this for determining access. It is always installed by default. It does replace many of the functions of sudo. And basically you log on and then you use SW role to change roles. There's over 150 different controls for defining the roles. And I've got a link somewhere to actually where you find out what the roles actually are. So you have authorizations, roles and privileges. And by the way, these policies can be centralized on an LDAP server, so that automatically, if you're using LDAP for your accounts, those users can be assigned the policies that they need. So you could have a role of a DBA and give them access to certain things, but not to other things, using enhanced RBAC. All right, they enhanced those click libraries, and they brought out something which I found very useful called the encrypted file system. So this is a key-based JFS2 file system, and if you see this E on the end of an LS, that tells you it's encrypted. And what happens is when you go to access the file, it decrypts it in memory. It is never unencrypted on the disk. It is always encrypted. Everything in that file system gets encrypted. It uses keys, which means you have to have the key in your key store in order to use it. If you don't have the key in your key store, you can't access it. And you can actually have those keys managed in LDAP, which is what I would recommend, because if you lose the keys, you lose access to the data. Not a good thing. By default, it's not enabled. You have to use the EFS enable. And there's an article here on how to actually use the encrypted file system with some examples. So I just wanted to point this out, because what it's really useful for is personal personally identifiable data. So if you need to have personally identifiable data on your server, you could put that data in an encrypted file system and know that it's always encrypted on the disk. Some of the other options that came in version 6, we have secure by default. And this is basically when you use that, it installs about 100 file sets, and then you have to go on and you individually add file sets that you want. So as an example, most of the network's not installed. And this is done at install time. There's also the File Permission Manager, which is the FPM command, and the purpose of that is to reduce any setuid bit programs. So you can run that, and you can run it such that it finds them. You can run it so that it changes them. It's something to be aware of that you may or may not want to use. Just be very careful when you run around changing setuid programs. Make sure you don't change ones that the operating system needs. It also brought out secure FTP and trusted execution, where basically you can have a trusted signature database. So think of it as after you install the system, you know it's clean. You create the trusted signature database. It goes through it, it double checks all this applications, etc., and saves them in that database. You can then use trust check regularly to make sure that important binaries aren't altered. So you're probably not going to want to check everything, but there are certain things that you want to do. And then the last one here I have is the trusted AIX, which uses mandatory access controls, requires that you turn on auditing, etc. And it supposedly removes the concept of root, although I have found that there are still things that need root access. So it's something that's worth looking into, and it is covered in that red book. Then in AIX version 7, they added a few more security things. Most of what they added was actually enhancements. As an example, they enhanced the encryption for the encrypted file system for IPsec and trusted execution. Plus, they added hardware-accelerated encryption. So on the Power 7 chips, they've now added some crypto stuff. They also added some security certifications. One that was of interest to a lot of people was the EAL4+. And they added some other stacks. You can now have up to 2,048 groups. They enhanced AIX Security Expert and RBAC. RBAC in particular was enhanced to add domain support. So now you can do some things with RBAC and domain support. They then retrofitted that to version 6 TL6. If you're running version 7 TL2, SP2 or 3, pretty much a lot of what you get in that is also in AIX 6.1 TL8, SP2 or 3. So they did retrofit a lot of things back there. And what's nice about the domain support is I can now use a domain to control access to volume groups, file systems, files, devices, etc. There's a lot of information on secured by default, and if you go to this NIST website, they actually have some information on security templates for AI Expert that NIST uses. As I said, I don't tend to use AI Security Expert. I tend to go and look at what it does and then implement that manually. The nice thing about all the security experts and other experts that IBM's providing is it does allow you to build an XML file that you can then deploy whenever you deploy servers. I sort of look at it that most of the time what I'm doing is creating my first LPAR, locking it down, taking a backup and using that for a NIM install, so effectively I do a similar thing. Okay, so let's talk about staying current. And we talked about this early on about firmware, etc. But the point I want to make here is when I say current, I mean really current. So as an example, I mentioned Service Pack 3 before. There were 3 major security holes that are patched. I've got the APAR numbers here. I can't remember if that's the version 6 or version 7 APAR number, but those were pretty serious holes. The VIO server, if you're at the very, very latest version, that also closes those holes. So just be aware that staying current is really important on AIX. And not just, there's also, by the way, a lot of performance things, etc., that are fixed. And then we, of course, add to this keeping your HMC up to date, because your HMC under the covers is a hybrid kind of Linux server, as well as keeping your firmware up to date. So don't underestimate the importance of that. I wanted to talk a little bit about RBAC, because a lot of people get very confused about what it is. Basically, the intent of RBAC is to provide security and administration flexibility and to let you create roles. We have 3 things. We have authorizations, roles, and privileges. So an authorization is simply how do I grant access to a command or function? A role is clearly authorizations that can be assigned, and then privileges are what lets me bypass a security restriction. So if I look at this, we've users roles in AIX resources, so I'll have something like AIX.filesystem.install.info. whatever. And what this is allowing me to do is figure out an access authorization. So here, I'm asking for the security attributes set on boot info. And it's saying I have to have the role of aix.system.boot.info. So here we go, aix.system.boot.info. And that lets me display boot information. And then there's a bunch of innate privileges that come with it. There are a lot of these by default. I think there's about 150 of them. So you just have to figure out how you want to assign users to them. And then, as I mentioned, in AIX7, we add the domain-based, and in PowerVM 2.2, they added RBAC on the VIO server as well, so you can implement it there. This is a little bit on the domain-based, and pretty much what we're talking about is there'll be an Etsy security domains, and in here we set up domains like HR and IT, and we'll have a set of payroll and who can access it, etc. There's some new commands, make DOM, ls DOM, change domain, remove domain, etc. You can then take things like file systems and volume groups and so on and actually put them into a domain. There are also some enhancements to auditing so that you can actually now audit events on a per role basis. So I can say, looking at the people that have the DBA role, please provide me with audit reports just on that. And there's a number of new stanzas and classes, etc. There is an advanced auditing readbook. I forgot to put the link in here, but advanced auditing is something that's a useful thing to know about, even if you never turn it on. LDAP is now integrated into AIX. You can use case-sensitive LDAP usernames. There's alias support, etc. And there is now an ls LDAP command that actually reports on Advanced Accounting AIX Security Expert. And they added support for Windows 2008 Active Directory. So, for instance, I'm not a big fan of Active Directory, but you have the ability to fairly simply integrate AIX with Active Directory if you want to get your users from there. You will, of course, always leave root as a local account. Some miscellaneous things, changes to password policies. They do not allow you to have a username of Jackie and a password of Jackie, as an example. They also disallowed patterns in passwords, so if you did something like ABC, 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 that wouldn't be allowed anymore. It looks for patterns. They've added support so that from AIX, if I use the -R LDAP option on my password, I can actually change my password on LDAP as well. They increased the number of groups from 128 to 2048. That is now tunable in sys0. So if you wanted to change it, you'd do a chdev on sys0. And then IBM also brought out PowerSC, and in PowerSC, they've added a number of functions. They've added the trusted boot, trusted logging, trusted network connect, and security compliance automation. And with PowerSC, it basically, in particular of interest to me, was the trusted logging, because it creates a tamper-proof repository for the system and audit logs. So they get stored remotely in such a way that they can't be modified. The trusted network connect, you can actually use that to basically look at where the access is coming from, and if it doesn't meet your corporate patch policies, then you don't let it connect. So there's some real power in this application. So in terms of trusted logging, what happens here is it uses a special vSCSI logging device, and it gets managed by the VIO server. So the first requirement is, of course, that there's a VIO server in the mix. It gets written to the repository on the VIO server, and the AIX virtual machine can no longer alter or remove those logs. But the logs still remain on the server. So this is a very good thing to do, particularly if you do have people trying to get into your systems all the time, because you now have completely trusted copies of your logs. With trusted boot, basically each virtual machine is going to have some information configured using the HMC, and when you're booting, it compares that information with the boot process and makes sure that they still should be trusted. So you do have to be on firmware 7.4 or above, but if you're on a modern Power 7 box, that shouldn't be an issue. I also have a note in here on the different editions because not everything comes with the Express version. So you really need to be on PowerSC standard to get trusted logging, trusted boot, and trusted network connect. And of course there's some prereqs down here of AIX versions and VIO server versions and firmware. So I wanted to make sure you're aware of those. I've only got a couple more slides, and then time permitting we'll go and log in and try out a few commands. So here's some articles and read books that are worth reading. There was a very, very good security lecture at Wright University on rootkits. The SANS group had some very good analyses on rootkits. There's some stuff on AIX IP security, and here's the link to the AIX Advanced Security Red Book. I also have a bunch of different helpful sites here. NIST has tools. You've got the Alerts at CERT, the High Tech Crime Investigators Association, and InfraGard, which are security organizations. Securityfocus.com, which has a lot of security information. If you need to look up IP addresses and do reverse lookups, you can go to these two Whois sites or Geek Tools. Those are also very helpful. And of course, this is the list of all of IBM's security products. This is the kickoff to the IBM version 6 security information. I've also got the version 7 one, information on AIX Security Expert, and then a lot of links on AIX hardening that are well worth looking at. And then just some additional links that are based on security. So that's the end of the presentation. I really want to thank you for logging in and being with us.